You talk about China phobia. So what exactly are the examples of what you call the China phobia that you've seen over the past few years?
Well, let me start a little bit with talking about what is China phobia. I mean, we think it is born of ignorance. It's a result of lack of knowledge about China, lack of understanding its real intentions. Now, so the result where it's transferred, and you can see it, is basically this anti-China sentiment that see everything China do in a downside or on the risk side of it. So if China give basically masks away, then it becomes a mask diplomacy. If it gives out a vaccine away, it becomes a vaccine diplomacy. If it's wanted to invest in a port, then basically it's a national security issues. It's basically what we think is really undermining the capacity and the ability of the other side, judgment and assessment of its basically ability to assess its own national security, which I don't think is the case.
All the examples you mentioned, they're not true?
Well, of course, what we believe is,
for example, masks, China trying to provide to the developing countries is also a goodwill. It contributes to China's diplomacy. So it's not true?
China has its own policies. It's working for us to protect its national interests and enhance its own influence. But when it is seen everything that China is doing based on conspiracy side, then what we call this a phobic basically sentiment on the issue.
If that were true, that there is a phenomenon of China phobia in the world, what are the reasons behind it? Is it out of a pure misunderstanding, lack of information and accurate information, or is it a product of realistic, hardcore, strategic competition and even rivalry between China and the United States?
It's a combination of both. It's a mixed bag of complex issues. Now, the lack of understanding China's goal, and that is an important matter. I mean, the fact that China is still explaining what is China about, it basically also tells a story that there is an issue, or I will call it a default in projecting China's soft power. But also on the other part is basically the strategical competition is real, right? China moved from a nobody very quickly, a nobody in the forest 20, 30 years ago, to become one of the biggest elephant in the forest. This is bringing really an anxiety. Now, also another part of that not only limited to China, but the rise of Asia, that soft power, the gravity movement from somewhere between US and Europe to go a little bit now to Asia, where of course it is China's rising, led by that, but also there is India, there is ASEAN today is basically providing more growth to the global economy more than European Union. And today, ASEAN is the biggest trading partner of China. So things are changing.
So you're saying, Karim, that when the economic weight of the so-called East, Asia, generally speaking, is rising, there is a lack of adjustment about that in the rest of the world, shifting itself from the earlier West-oriented approach, understanding, and rhetorics, and narrative, and system to a reality today. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, especially in a world that, when the gravity is coming from Asia that has different value system than the Western one. I mean, this is creating something really different, especially for people like me that coming from developing countries, basically background, that we see, we have other, I would say, narratives, other options. The kids, the future generation doesn't necessarily, the best universities in the world doesn't necessarily mean going to the traditional, basically, destinations. We have other basically top universities in China, in Singapore, in Japan, and even now in India. This is creating a new narrative that, our generation is going through this change. Yeah. And what we see is changes create that kind of sensitivity along the side.
At this moment, can you nail down if you were trying to present to your friends through this book how exactly the world is changing and what exactly is China. And don't forget, we want to take into account the changes that are taking place in China over the past few years as well.
China is creating a big change in areas that I know. Now, Central Asia, Middle East, this is my mandate, basically. I see today that the top, I would say, that the pyramid of the society, the top pyramid society in the Arab world, I will speak, is really interested for the first time. I've been in China now more than 20 years, to engage strategically with China. This narrative, I didn't hear it, I would say, 5 years ago. I mean, the fact that there is US-China trade war has somehow provided a strategical opportunity, and I would say a kind of a free advertising for China, because the Arabs are looking there and saying, wow, okay, number one, the big boss is hitting hard China, the peer competitive. Why is that? China has something to do that require all of that kind of mashing China. So I see a big change in the attitude from the developing worlds towards China. This is also, you can see it now, the level of the ambassadors, let's say, that's sent to China, to Beijing. Now, it used to be just a diplomat. Now you are seeing heavyweight diplomats that have a direct relation with the decision maker in their countries being sent to Beijing. I see now that my business is we do a lot of infrastructure investment. So you see decision makers at those areas are really interested to send their kids to China to learn the Chinese stories, right? The big families in the Middle East are really interested to meet their peers in China. These things has basically, I haven't seen it. I mean, this is something new.
Karim, you and your father wrote this book together. That's really quite a sweet, shall I say, result when looking at the book. Your father was one of those researchers coming to China decades ago to learn and also to introduce China to the Middle East. Meanwhile, he has been serving as head of the diplomatic community in Beijing during the first 10 years of the 21st century. And at the same time, he has you, who is quite a dynamic young entrepreneur and certainly a thinker in this sense about where China is with the rest of the world. So what I'm trying to ask is about the generational differences, the lenses through which you and your father looked at China.
I mean, we belong to the same value system, I would say. However, his experience with China is different than mine. Now, he started coming in the 90s, during the 90s to China. He was an ambassador here, then dean of the Arab Corp later on. Met with most of the officials. So his experience is different than mine. When I was 18, I came to China. I studied here, I started up, I become an entrepreneur here and political scientist. So Chinese families in the society. So that top-down, I would say, approach. And I think the family conversations are real, the most real ones. So in that sense, I was amazed that I refused to inherit his political beliefs, right? So that generational thinking, and I see it now in my kids, my daughter, also kind of refusing to take what I think the world is doing. And this is why we wrote the book, because I think the new generation should actually have kind of, I would say, independent thinking. They should look at the issues from different lenses.
Were there some flashing points between you and your father when writing about this, that you guys had really different opinions, and who exactly when?
Well, I mean, I should pay respect, so I wouldn't say who won. However, I mean, his generation provide wisdom to the matter that is important. I think my generation provide more factual, fact-based kind of observation on things that we understand.
do you see the geographical locations of places that we talk about here that would also have a tremendous impact on their perceptions about China and therefore the so-called phenomenon of China phobia?
I mean, certainly Middle East people, I would say, have a general positive opinion about China. Now, due to historical, basically, bonding relationship, that was the base. But also, as I said, of course, the relationship of course, it has its own issues, its own problems, right? However, the fact that today China is Middle East's biggest trading partner, and Middle East represent a huge and important market, not only for the Chinese, basically, products, but also something new that's happening, that it is also a potential fund resource for the FDIs towards China, right? What we see today is the Arab sovereign funds today have allocation of less than 2% in the 20% of global economy. So there is a lack of that stuff. I was in the Middle East for the last 2-3 months. I came back. I mean, there is a fundamental change towards the way that the Middle East is looking at China as a partner and basically as a source of a know-how in a way that suits their own experience.
Very fascinating about that, the latest changes. But you also realize, Karim, living in this country, having Chinese families, that China is also constantly changing over the past few years, just one of those examples of changes. So how would you articulate the logics of changes?
I mean, when I came to China over 20 years ago, when I was working in Beijing, a trendy hello was 吃饭了吗 in Chinese, which is have you eaten, have you had your meal, right? And now I see the government is pushing hard to have this, what they call it, the 光盘行动, which is basically, empty plates of China. So this transaction from have you eaten to back to, please don't waste your food. This is a change. I was living with young Chinese people that always saw tomorrow better than today. So that somehow, you can see it, that self-confident nation is rising. Sometimes, of course, over self-confident. However, you see that positiveness in Chinese young generations, right? I mean, especially coming with the fact that, let's say, with the 20th part of the Congress, just said have a 2035, by 2035, that China will become a mid-income nation. That meaning more or less, in my understanding, that it will double the economy, the GDP per capita, etc. So having that kind of government, I would say, that telling you in 10 to 15 years, you will double basically your income, your life will be much better, and this is how we're going to do it. That creates this kind of positiveness that I see, and that vibration I see in the Chinese society.
That self-confidence, will that further escalate the degree of so-called China phobia, which you described in the book? Or is it going to help to reduce, if done well, some misunderstandings that others has about China?
Very good question. I think that's the point. I mean, what we believe that we are in a transactional, basically, period. Overall, for the Chinese people, more or less, there is a jet lag of understanding that their economy, their nation, become more or less a superpower. Now that requires kind of a global power, and that requires a global citizen thinking, which is an important, basically, to project China as a global power, right? So it's not only a government issue; it's also about the people understanding that China's issues become global issues when a mayor or a governor or even a director at a ministry in China make a decision. He need now understand that, I mean, that impact could be sounded in somewhere in Africa, in places that he never even heard about, right? I mean, the fact that there was no Chinese tourists due to the pandemic, basically animals suffered in in Thailand and in Europe, right? When China stopped moving, then the oil prices go down, and then you have the physical deficit in Africa and in Middle East. So everything China do now today have a global impact, and it's a matter of time. It takes time to understand how influential become China as well. It's a matter. It will take time for the Chinese people to understand that they are actually belong to a superpower. It takes time, but it will be there, I believe.
Finally, Karim, before we wrap up, you write this book together with your father. I really wonder whether your daughter, even though she's very young, ever read what is written in the book, or you ever talked about that to her? What was her reaction?
I have a daughter and a son, right? 14 and 11. Now, I think
so. When a daughter and a son, that in Chinese character, that's 好, right?
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think they are still with the fiction kind of books, not really interested yet. In that topic, and I think it's a good thing. Let them have their own kind of I would call it bubbles, thinking that life is kind of the la la land, until later on they will realize the difficulties. And I really think that by understanding facts, and I think the best way to understand China is for people to come here, right? Some people will say, how to not get a China phobia, basically, is sentence. I say it's just go and in your country get try to have a Chinese friend. I think Chinese people, the normal people, are the best ambassadors for China.
Karim Alwadi, thank you so much.